Hello everyone and welcome back to our revision channel. This week's focus will be on the Victorian era and how it influenced Charles Dickens as he was writing A Christmas Carol. Before we begin, as ever, please make sure you have your pen, paper, flashcards ready so that you can make notes as we go along with the video. So of course we have to begin with Charles Dickens himself, the author, the man behind A Christmas Carol. So Charles Dickens was born in 1812 and was one of 8 children. He was born into a middle-class family and he was lucky enough to attend school. He believed that education was the key to escaping a life of poverty. However, this good fortune was short-lived after his father came into some financial difficulties and was put into a debtor's prison. At just 12 years old, Dickens was split up from his family and was sent to Warren's blacking factory to live and work by himself. In this time, Dickens endured the appalling working conditions that many of the poor faced in this era. Dickens was able to experience poverty firsthand and used this to portray the unjust disparities between the rich and the poor. So just as I've written just at the bottom here, Dickens uses his work to challenge Victorian elites and aristocracy by making them consider these kind of social problems and bringing to the forefront of their minds the real destitution that was occurring in Victorian Britain. So continuing on with our contextual knowledge, it is really important that we remember Thomas Malthus and the ideas that he advocated. Born in 1766, Malthus had experienced life before Queen Victoria's reign and heavily criticised the many poor laws that had been put in place prior to the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. In his book, An Essay on the Principle of Population, Malthus argued that famine, disease, war or calamity were the only way to control the ever-growing population. Malthus believed that previous poor laws encouraged the poor to continue to procreate and essentially blamed the poor for the cycle of poverty. He shared his extremist views and argued that those living in poverty were contributing to a lack of resources and were therefore undeserving of help. In stave 1 of the novella, Scrooge abruptly states, if they would rather die, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. It is within this quotation we see Dickens's hatred for a capitalist ideology as he opposes Malthus's theory. Here he uses Scrooge as a tool to showcase the ignorant attitudes of Victorian society, in that they believed the working class were deemed unworthy of support. Scrooge is purposely depicted as a cold-hearted, selfish man through his lack of sympathy for the poor, merely viewing them as idle and an inconvenience. He, like many other wealthy Victorians, viewed the poor as undeserving of help and believed that they should be left to struggle without any intervention from the government. Continuing on from that, the adjective surplus also further emphasises Dickens's disgust at this ignorance and highlights their lack of understanding that these people are crying out for help. The fact that they are viewed as a surplus could indicate that they believe that there's too many of them and it's not the wealthy's responsibility to intervene. Life in Victorian society was also categorised by a strict hierarchy of social class. The upper classes lived a lavish lifestyle and prospered greatly during the Victorian era. They were able to capitalise on the labour of those directly beneath them. The middle class were relatively prosperous during this time as they owned and managed vast business empires. Lots of the middle class found themselves with more job opportunities and able to earn a decent living. The working class was split into 2 categories, skilled workers and unskilled workers. While skilled workers had priorities on jobs during the Industrial Revolution, they still lived in poverty. Unskilled labourers found themselves vulnerable to the exploitation from the middle and upper classes, finding themselves desperate to provide for their families. So what was the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution took place between the 18th and 19th century and was an event that largely characterised the Victorian era. Machines and factories meant faster production of goods, which then meant for higher profits. Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol towards the end of the Industrial Revolution. The mechanisation of the industry meant less demand for workers as machines replaced the ordinary person. This meant that Britain was going through an economic boom, but there was a detrimental impact on the working class as they no longer had steady employment. The Industrial Revolution exacerbated the inequalities within society as it became increasingly difficult for the working class to earn enough to support themselves and their families. So, what were the societal impacts of the Industrial Revolution? There were two major impacts of the Industrial Revolution, which were overpopulation and childhood. People had to move to the cities in order to find work. This then created slums to accommodate the large influx of people. Dickens emphasises how the Industrial Revolution negatively impacted society by discussing the surplus population and the poor living conditions of the poor who lived in Victorian London. Many children were also exploited by the greed of this industry. They were manipulated and forced into abject misery in order to help support their families as they navigated an impoverished childhood. Throughout his novella, Dickens is highly critical of the darker consequences of the Industrial Revolution, and he presents these attitudes in Scrooge through the way he treats his worker, Bob, before his redemption. The Poor Law Amendment Act came into effect in 1834. The Poor Law was amended to reduce the cost of helping the poor. Those that were desperate for assistance were sent to workhouses, and it essentially made it illegal for them to be begging on the street. The working conditions were absolutely abhorrent and left many feeling miserable and desperate. It stated that for the poor to receive any money or any support, they must go into these workhouses. Whilst many would rather die than go there, many rich Victorians believed this was a viable option for the poor and highly supported the running of these businesses. Dickens portrays these views through Scrooge's happiness to hear that the prisons and union workhouses were in full vigour. Scrooge's tone here is cruel, and Dickens uses him as a voice to reflect the apathetic beliefs of the rich and how truly problematic they were. He challenges the law and the reader's own views surrounding these workhouses. Another belief that many had was the notion that the poor wasted any money they had on drinking and gambling. Due to this, many believed that the poor should not be given any sort of charity. A common attitude among the rich was that the lower classes were lazy and immoral. Scrooge challenges this by using idle and poor interchangeably, which could suggest that they are the same thing. Again, Dickens criticises the lack of social responsibility shared by many rich Victorians as he implores them to see their prejudices are damaging society. So whilst that is a lot of information, it's all relevant and applicable to why Scrooge writes the way he does. So in Stave 2, for example, Dickens uses the ghost of Christmas past to emphasise Scrooge's misdeeds. Scrooge is transported to his office where he relives the moment Belle calls off their engagement after another idol has displaced her. After being confronted, Scrooge states, "This is the even-handed dealing of the world. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth, which ultimately reveals the injustice of Victorian society and the absolute fear of poverty." So let's break this quotation down. Even-handed. This is quite an ironic statement. How can poverty be fair and equal? Here, Dickens highlights the injustice of poverty in Victorian society. He again links to Malthusian ideas, criticising the common, immoral mentality many shared as they believed the poor were lazy and did not deserve their help. Furthermore, through Dickens's own experiences of the workhouse, we see his fears and concerns regarding poverty in this line. He uses Scrooge here to suggest that poverty is something to be afraid of because of the terrible conditions it leaves its victims in. Moreover, by using the adjective hard coupled with the noun nothing, Dickens emphasises just how truly terrifying living in the Victorian era was for the lower classes. While Scrooge was happy previously, he soon grows up realising that he must make profits to ensure that he is never affected by poverty. Finally, Dickens has Scrooge deliver this line in quite a harsh way. This could reveal his fear, but perhaps hint at the fact that many Victorians had become corrupted and consumed with wealth rather than fulfilling their social responsibility of helping those that deserved and needed it. As we've spoken a lot about, Dickens uses his novella as a plea for Victorian society to change. He emphasises this through his protagonist, Ebenezer Scrooge. Let's break down the protagonist's name. Dickens's relationship with religion was more complex than we may assume, but the biblical roots of the name Ebenezer cannot be coincidental. Ebenezer is mentioned 3 times in the Bible and refers to a stone of help in the book of Samuel. The name is taken from 2 Hebrew words, Eben meaning stone and Ezer meaning helper. Ultimately, to many people, this stone represents repentance, mercy, and healing, all of which Scrooge comes to embrace by the end of the novella as he transforms into a kind and generous human being. The term Scrooge was first used as early as 1844 as an adjective in Thomas Hood's magazine and comic miscellany, where he wrote, "Whether we have not grown Scroogey." Here, Hood does not mean a person who has a miserly approach to life. Instead, he wonders if people's heads have not become more inaccessible, our hearts more impregnable, our ears and eyes more dull and blind to sounds and sights of human misery. This perfectly encapsulates Scrooge's personality. He is ignorant to the needs of the poor, refusing to help those that are desperate, as he chooses to support the abhorrent institutions of prisons and workhouses as a way of punishing those he deems idle and immoral. So why did Dickens do this? Dickens was an advocate for social justice. He wanted society to treat each other fairly and equally. He addressed these issues in his novella to hold a mirror up to his readers and have them question their own morals and actions towards the poor. Dickens uses his novella to highlight the consequences of inequality, of a social hierarchy, of the lack of a welfare state and education for all. He discusses how ignorance is bred out of a lack of education and want occurs when one is unable to provide for themselves or attain employment. Dickens wanted his novella to have a sledgehammer impact, with 20,000 times the force he could exert. Dickens sought to criticise and condemn the ignorance of Victorian society by having his readers confront their own prejudices. Ultimately, Dickens's novella is an allegorical tale which warns that selfishness and greed will ultimately lead to life and death of misery and torment. Thanks everybody for listening. Make sure you bring in your flashcards, your homework, your whatever you've written on, and I'll see you again next time.